Okay, so welcome everyone today to our virtual session. This is the fourth session in our 6-part Zoom series in which we explore the concepts of community justice in practice and the Neighbourhood Justice Centre model. This session, Corrections and Community Justice, will begin in just a few moments. We opened back in 2007 and we are Australia's first and only community justice centre and a world-first international mentor court. We are part of a global network of over 80 community justice centres worldwide, and we sit within the Specialist Courts and Programs Division of Magistrates Courts, Victoria. We've had many evaluations done over the year, and compared to other magistrates courts, the Neighbourhood Justice Centre has proven its ability to reduce recidivism, with offenders 25% less likely to re-offend. As mentioned in the video, offenders have increased accountability, with clients nearly twice as likely to complete community corrections orders, as well as an increase in compliance with intervention orders. And equally as important, the community of the City of Yarra has an increased confidence in the justice system. I now welcome Beth Swales. Beth is the Officer in charge of Community Correctional Services at the NJC. Beth has dedicated almost 25 years to CCS and has worked primarily in the southeast of Melbourne before coming to the NJC almost 11 years ago. Beth is passionate about protecting the community and working with clients. In her work, she's focused on helping people who have committed offences to develop pro-social skills and address the issues that led to their offending. She leads a small team of case managers at the NJC who are dedicated CCS practitioners. I welcome you, Beth, today.
Okay, hi guys, I'm Beth. I'd like to acknowledge as well there is a really diverse audience in the room today. So some of you have worked in Community Correctional Services and some of you Community Correctional Services will be new. So I'm going to talk a bit about what Community Correctional Services is for those of you who aren't au fait with that, and then get into how it functions within a community justice model. I think as I'm talking about Community Correctional Services, you'll see that our service provision is actually really well aligned to a community approach, because we are actually delivering justice services in the community already as part of our normal business. So Community Correctional Services sits under the Department of Justice and Community Safety, and we have been around for many, many years. I think we were with Department of Welfare at one point and then moved over to Department of Justice from there. We have a role in, I suppose, the provision of community safety by monitoring and managing clients who are on community correction orders and also parole to address their risk of reoffending in the community, so that they hopefully don't further offend down the track. Community correction orders is the name of the community orders that people couldn't get from court or be sentenced to at court, and parole is a parole period on a sentence that's managed by the parole board. So we look after both of those orders, people on both of those sorts of orders. In relation to sitting at in the City of Yarra in the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, the only difference between my team and that of other community correctional services throughout the state is we don't supervise folk with current or previous sexual offending. We are a community centre and we have community members, vulnerable community members coming in all the time for meetings, etc. Less so with COVID, of course, but pre-COVID, obviously, there were lots of community meetings, etc., with children and other vulnerable members of our community attending the centre. And I suppose it's irresponsible for us to be, bringing in people with current or prior sexual offending into that space, so we don't. Other than that, we work with City of Yarra residents who are on either court orders or parole. So with community correction, well, I'll start with parole actually, it's probably easier. With parole space, that's a term, somebody might be sentenced to a term of imprisonment with a non-parole period. So the person might be, say, for example, sentenced to 6 years imprisonment with 4-year non-parole period. So as it approaches their period where they may be released onto parole to serve the rest of their sentence, they need to apply to the parole board for that to occur. They need to ask for parole, to be considered for parole anyway. An assessment will be conducted by our teams, and I'll get to that soon because it's quite similar to the process for court orders as well. So pre-release on parole, somebody is assessed. We start at that point. Also pre-community correction order, for the most part, we start at that pre-sentence. We're not coming in after and picking stuff up. We're actually assessing people prior to sentencing in those cases as well. The way case management runs, there are some slight nuance differences, but essentially we manage clients the same way. So with community correction orders, there's several sorts of orders. On the lower end of things, if somebody, for example, has court fines or infringements, they can be converted into fine conversion orders. So they solely do community work, and that's in relation to the amount of fines that they had. So there's a conversion rate for court fines, and it's a whole different process for infringement fines. But regardless, they will simply be given a community correction order, and that's an opportunity for them to work their fines off through the provision of community work. The other unassessed orders predominantly are community work only orders. So somebody may go to court and be sentenced for lower level offending, and they may be sentenced to a community work only order. And the sole purpose of that order is for them to complete community work. When I'm talking about case management moving forward, that's not provided to those individuals, because really our role in those cases is to manage somebody to make sure that they're attending community work. So we need to refer them to a community work site. We need to make sure that they're going to community work. And if they don't, we need to take action by returning those orders back to court. With the others, with the community correction orders that are assessed and parole, now with community correction orders that are assessed, there might be two sorts of orders. One is that somebody is sentenced at court to commence a community correction order that day. In other cases, they might be sentenced at court to serve a term of imprisonment followed by a community correction order. So what will happen is they might, say, be given 3 months sentence of imprisonment, and then on the day of release, they commence the community correction order from that date. In those cases, it sounds very much like parole, except they're guaranteed to get that, I suppose, service in the community and support and supervision in the community, whereas with parole, it's really at the discretion of the parole board as to whether or not they're assessed as being a suitable risk and released onto a parole order. So it's pretty much guaranteed in the court space, and then that's managed by the courts. So if somebody doesn't comply with their order, that's reported back to the courts, whereas if somebody doesn't comply with parole, it's reported to the parole board. Essentially, there's been a whack of research in the last 30 plus years about what works about addressing offending behaviour with people on court orders and parole. And the research has been resoundingly the same the entire time. There's been no change. The thing that works is a two-pronged approach. Problem solving, which doesn't mean we solve their problems. We're actually working with clients to improve their problem-solving skills, plus empathy and rapport. So having that great relationship with the client. One without the other is not going to cut it. We need to have both. So that's, I suppose, essentially one of the research findings that underpin our practice. And the other part of the research is what doesn't work. And what doesn't work is over-intervening with people who are at low risk of reoffending. That might be for a variety of reasons, because we're dragging people into the criminal justice system who otherwise would have been low risk. There could be contamination with other clients as they're going into high-level programs with high-risk clients. It could be a range of reasons for that, but really it's not something that's appropriate for low-risk clients. So if somebody's assessed as being low risk of reoffending, we have as little to do with them as possible. We're really about referring them to appropriate programs. We do assessments first, and I'll talk about the actual process on a community correction order in a sec. We'll assess their needs. We'll refer them to community programs. Essentially, we will assess low-risk clients, but we refer them to programs to address their risk factors, such as counselling for drug alcohol, for example, might be appropriate. Community work might be a part of their order. They might have mental health issues, so we'll make appropriate referrals in that space. There'll be a range of issues. They still get the referral process, but we're not actually conducting supervision with them and really getting into the nitty-gritty of their offending and behaviour, etc., as we would with anybody who's moderate or high risk of reoffending. So essentially, we start by assessing a client, and we start the assessment process pre-sentence. So in either parole space or in the court space, we have a level of service inventory that we use, and it measures their general risk in the community, their needs, their dynamic risk factor needs, and their responsivity issues, or what is it that's going to potentially be a roadblock for that person gaining access, or something that needs to be considered to support that person. And it could be responsivity issues, could be anywhere from chronic homelessness, which might have impacted. There's a lot of people who are chronically homeless, but they're fine at, that's not a responsivity. They're fine at actually showing up to appointments and organising their life in the way that they're living it at this point. But sometimes it might be a responsivity issue. So we've got to be really careful about making generalisations. I talk about when we're assessing clients, it's building the elephant essentially. And that comes from an old poem from Kipling about there were 6 blind men of Indishan went to see an elephant, and one's got their ears, so it's like, oh, it's papyrus. It's like papyrus, and one's got their tail, and so it's a rope. One's got its legs, so it's like a trunk. And they're all arguing over this elephant, but they're not building the whole picture. And together, working together, we're building that picture. So that's what we're trying to do at the start. Pre-court, it might be a very basic assessment, just really looking at their general risk of reoffending. That doesn't change over the course of the order unless it's a really, really long order. Some paroles are really, really long, and that might go down. So, but that's looking at things that can't change. So their prior convictions, whether they're arrested under the age of 16, but some things can change, like are they currently unemployed? Over time, they may get employment, and that might no longer be an issue. Some criminal friends, again, they may change their peer group and move towards a more pro-social peer group. Drug alcohol problems that are influencing or impacting on work and school, those sorts of things. So there's a range of, I suppose, those sort of risk factors that are very difficult to shift over a period of the life of the order. The actual issues can be addressed over the life of the order. They may move away from negative peers. They may gain employment, but the way that the scoring happens for the general risk, it's over a 12-month period. So, and I suppose the majority of court orders are about 12 months. They can range from 6 to longer, 3-4 years, in fact, in the county court, but generally most of our orders are about 12 months in duration, and so those sort of shifts aren't going to happen on our scoring, but it will in their lives, if that kind of makes sense. Post sentence for medium and high risk clients, we work very hard at really building the elephant, so it's not just the framework of the elephant. We really get down to the nitty gritty, so we understand all of their needs in the community so that we can make appropriate referrals to address those needs, but also work with them to identify themselves, their needs, so that they can in future start to identify early on in the piece when there's emerging issues that are starting to happen for them, and they're able to address them themselves because they've got the skill set now to actually identify moving forward what they're doing and how they're going. So that's sort of something that we do in supervision. at the end of the day, we're essentially managing somebody's risk of reoffending in the community. We need to not lose focus on that, especially, I suppose, at the end of the day. So I should have actually mentioned both parole and community correction orders, they're not mandated clients. We call them mandated clients, but they're not technically mandated until, well, they are once they've signed up to it. But nobody can be sentenced to an order or be given parole without their consent, informed consent. So we actually work with them so they understand what it is they're signing up for, but they make that choice. The option in a community correction order space may be prison. That may be their only option. We don't have suspended sentences anymore. It may be, well, if you don't want to do an order, you go to jail. But somebody might prefer a short, sharp sentence than actually having to face and address their issues. So it's not easy for anybody, I suppose, you know, when you're making huge changes in your life, potentially. So that's the assessment process. And then post-court, we'll assess them more thoroughly. Sometimes the court will ask for an extended pre-sentence assessment, and we do a more thorough assessment at that point. That's when an individual is quite complex, etc. There might be a whole range of issues, and trying to tease those out isn't going to happen in an on-the-spot assessment prior to going back, prior to sentencing. So we have to kind of unpack it a bit more and really build that elephant, because it's not apparently walking into the room. So that's something we do. If not post-sentence, we do all of that work to make sure that we're covering off on everything. Then what I suppose we do is make those referrals and work in supervision with our clients around the problem solving, and also relating some of the issues back to their offending behaviour. So, for example, they'll go to a drug and alcohol counsellor to address their substance abuse issues, but we'll be working with them ourselves about how that's actually impacted on their choices to offend and not offend. So we're kind of making those connections around their offending, etc. So at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't comply with their order, they might reoffend during the course of their order, or they just may not show up. So sometimes people get an order and then run off into the sunset and we don't see them. Some people, it's a bit messier than that. Most people, I suppose, it's a bit messier than that. They might have some unacceptable absences. So once you're actually committed to doing the order, you are mandated at that point to follow the rules and regulations and meet, I suppose, certainly obligations related to that order. So that's when people are mandated. Sometimes people struggle in the space to comply by showing up for appointments or engaging. I think shame has a lot to do with some of the engagement issues, etc. We're very mindful of that. So trying to give them a safe space to really explore that in a non-judgmental environment, and how I suppose some of their choices that they have been making in the past have impacted on their situation today, and how they could, I suppose, build skills to move forward without making the same choices. Giving them options, I suppose, for different choices. So we monitor their compliance with all the program conditions as well as coming to see us. And if they're not actually complying with the community correction order, we take the order back to court and we actually do our own prosecution at magistrate court level. But if it was for county court or Supreme Court, then it goes through Office of Public Prosecution. And with the parole board, there's not such a formal process. Well, it is a formal process, but it's on paper. So a report will go to the parole board outlining their lack of compliance, and the parole board will sit on that and make a decision. So it's a very similar process, that journey the whole way through. I think the difference between the Neighbourhood Justice Centre is a lot of pre-sentence activity that occurs here. So you saw in the short video that there's a range of client services available here at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. So I'm going to use a vague example of a made-up person who I'm going to call Joe. So say, for example, I was working at Dandenong Magistrates Court and Joe has appeared before the court, and he has been homeless for a long time, He has substance abuse issues up the wazoo because he's self-medicating. He suffers from schizophrenia, and he has not coped very well with the symptoms of that. He's extremely symptomatic. He's having lots of hallucinations. He's really worried about reality, very fearful every day, and using substances any substances he can get his hand on to try and dampen his experience of life at that time with that illness. He has struggled with mental health services in the past, and the medication that he's been prescribed hasn't really helped very much, but there's been a lot of negative side effects for him as well. So it's impacted on his sleeping, his appetite, all sorts of areas of his life, and he hasn't felt comfortable on those at all. Much easier for him, he feels, to just blank it out with any drugs he can get his hand on at that point. He's burned most of his bridges with his family. He's really got no support in the community. Now, does Joe sound to you like somebody who's going to be able to successfully navigate a community correction order in that state? Not really. So there's a little option there. It's either maybe a community correction order or jail. There are some HISP. There's in mainstream courts there is some support, but it's not the wraparound services that poor old Joe needs. If he was to come to the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, upon presentation at some point somebody would identify that this guy is really unstable and really needing a whole lot of supports and assistance. Now, that could be the court, it could be their lawyer. It might be that Joe just hangs around the area anyway and has been into the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. You don't need to be on the court list or involved with the court to access services at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. You just need to be a resident of the City of Yarra, or Aboriginal with close ties to the City of Yarra, or homeless with close ties to the City of Yarra. So Joe may have just been somebody that we're aware of anyway and tried to engage in services, but also through the court process, he might have been picked up at any point and referred to client services. We have Liz from Launch Housing here. So we've got a housing service provider Liz sits on site, but the agency is in the community. So she's a conduit between the agency. We don't do anything in isolation. We partner all the time so that we've got those community connections at all time rather than being a standalone. So we've got somebody from Launch Housing here who can help Joe. We have somebody from St Vincent's or Clarendon Clinic, same, for mental health, and she, mental health clinician, so she can help Joe. We've got 2 drug and alcohol clinicians on site who are also able to assist Joe. So they'll assist Joe to stabilise somewhat before I then assess him for a community correction order. That may take a significant amount of time. It may take a little time. So what will happen is the magistrate will make those referrals and then he'll defer the sentence so that Joe can come back and he can see how Joe's tracking. And it's a process and everybody's different. It may be that there's a number of deferrals before he's actually ready to be assessed for a community correction order until he's stable enough for that. By no means we're walking in and everyone's fixed and hallelujah, it's just a tail end. We're not riding in on the coattails of client services, but they sure set the ship up so that it's going to sail straight, hopefully, for the rest of the order. With most of our referrals, I think a lot of people mistake that because we're in a building with a whole lot of service providers and we do have a really strong collaborative approach to supporting our clients in the City of Yarra, they think that we're on easy street, but it's not just client services that we utilise. We utilise a whole lot of community agencies to continue that support with clients. Some of that might be started with client services. So for, say, example, one of the drug and alcohol clinicians might have started working with a client and referred them to Carinish for a specific program with drug alcohol or a specific counsel, drug alcohol counselling. And then we will, I suppose, manage those referrals and continue that on as well. So we've got a whole lot of relationships with community agencies that we continue to utilise. as well as with Department of Justice have certainly programs for the more pointier and high-risk clients. So if somebody is really high risk, say with serious violence, then we'll be accessing those programs as well for our clients. But predominantly we try and make it as community as possible, so using community agencies as much as possible, so that they can keep accessing those services without having to return to the criminal justice system to access those services. The community agencies anyone can access, and we're just helping them to make those connections and build those support networks around them. So one of the things is the client services factor. That said, anytime we need client services, they're here for us. So for example, if somebody came in today and they were really at risk of suicide, I would call the mental health clinician. I wouldn't, if they were on site or they were available, I'd be grabbing them as my first port of call, rather than risking losing them, getting them to St Vincent's for triage. So we've got those supports on site as we need as well. And we do, it's a bit of a two-way street as well, because clients might be known to us and they've come to client services through another mechanism. We might have some support or some information we're able to assist client services with as well. Or also, we've already got the rapport with the client, so we can assist to build the rapport between that particular practitioner as well as the client. So it's a bit of a two-way street. We're a multidisciplinary team. That's how we roll. The second thing that really supports us here is problem-solving meetings. So we have a Neighbourhood Justice Officer here at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, and they run problem-solving meetings. Again, anybody can refer to those meetings. It could be the court, could be lawyers, could be somebody from client services, it could be corrections. So I'll give you an example. I had a chap once who had some family violence issues. He'd been offending. He'd been perpetrating family violence. It was he was from the African community, and he had a whole lot of elders around him who said he shouldn't be on this order. He shouldn't have to do anything. We've told him to stop drinking and not hit his wife, and that's it, done. And that was a really tricky space to manage, because sure, I get where they're coming from, and certainly that's been their tradition, the way of dealing with things, but it wasn't working in the current environment, because the elders weren't living anywhere near this particular individual and his wife, who was they were also putting pressure on the wife to come back to reside with this partner, despite the intervention order being in place precluding that. So it was a whole lot of mess and a whole lot of nuance that need to be addressed as well. There was only one person on the client, one client, I should say, on a community correction order, remember, but there were a whole lot of players that were influencing him, giving him very different messaging from the messaging we were trying to give and the court was trying to give. So a problem-solving meeting was a great space for that, and it can be that diverse. So what happens is essentially the person's referred for the problem-solving meeting process. They meet with the Neighbourhood Justice Officer, who it is a voluntary process. We can't direct people to do this. She will meet with them to assess whether they're suitable and they are able to assist. She will gather together all of the people who might be involved, and that comes from the client. We take a really client-centred approach. So, for example, in this case, those 5 elders that were involved with this person all showed up to the meeting. They were all invited to the meeting. They all showed up for the meeting, as did an interpreter, as did a community worker, as did another elder, a 6th elder, who was there to represent the victim of the offences, as well as one of the older sons showed up for this meeting as well. So the actual meeting is very structured. So the Neighbourhood Justice Neighbourhood Justice Officer actually goes through what the process is going to be, and we go around the table to raise any concerns or issues that we think in relation to the client, starting with the client. So why do you think we're here? What do you think the problems are at this point? And then we'll go around the table and discuss any of the issues as they arise. And then once that happens, we develop strategies, I suppose, to address those issues. Some of the strategies are going to be allocated to the client to complete. Some of the strategies might be for us to complete. So then you've got an outcome. Now, everything that happens in the meeting is essentially confidential, but the outcome will be the outcomes and agreed actions. They might go back to the court, for example, if the court's requested the problem-solving process. They might come back to corrections if we've requested the problem-solving process. Although, quite frankly, if we've made the referral, we're going to be in the room anyway, so we were there to hear that. So that's probably less of an issue. That's been really helpful because, frankly, I see a client at most maybe an hour a week. They go back into the community and they're with family and their peers the rest of the time, predominantly. So if I'm giving a really different message, somebody might be really motivated during our supervision session to make the changes. Yep, I know what I've got to do and I want to do this and I want to do that. Walk out the door and then, hey, Joe, how are you? Let's go get on. That's all out the window in 5 minutes. Whereas if we can get the main support people for that individual all on the same page and we're all working to support them with the same goals, the client's goals, then it's going to be winner, winner, chicken dinner. And quite frankly, I've got a whole lot of people out in the community then who are actually doing my job for me and reinforcing my messaging. So that's got to work, I say. And that has been shown to work. The other thing we've got is judicial monitoring. Now, judicial monitoring is actually a mainstream process, but it started at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. We call them court reviews. So essentially what happens is when our magistrate sentences somebody to a community correction order, every 8 weeks, they go back before the court. Now, closed court is a formal process, and we certainly don't do that. But what we do is ensure that the courtroom is empty other than the client, their case manager from correction. The magistrate actually comes down to sit opposite at the bar table rather than sitting up at the bench. And the clerk is oftentimes there as well, although not necessarily. We provide a 2-page, I suppose, brief look at where the client is at this moment, so their current circumstances. It's not about compliance, although compliance will be part of it. It's a really holistic snapshot of, if they're not counterintuitive, those words, but it is a whole of snapshot, I suppose, of where that client is at the moment. Prior to actually going into court on the day, the magistrate will have had that and read that report. We'll take the report in and sit with the client, go through the report and make sure that nothing's changed. As you can imagine, our clients can oftentimes live really dynamic lives, and what was hunky-dory yesterday may not be hunky-dory today. So that's a space for them to actually let us know really up-to-date information about where things are at. We might have also gotten it wrong. That doesn't happen very often, but occasionally we might have misunderstood something, reported it incorrectly. Client has a space to tell us that then as well, so we can correct that in court. And the third thing I suppose we try and do is identify with the client what they'd like to discuss with the magistrate, what they'd like to highlight. For example, they may have just gotten employment, or they may have been clean from their drug of choice for the last 6 months and had that 6-month anniversary and really been celebrating that. Whatever it is that they want to talk about, or they could be frustrated with something. They might not be able to access a service, a particular service that they have been trying to access, and they really think that that's hampering them. Really, anything goes. They can talk to the magistrate about where they're at the moment and their progress. So when we go into for the judicial monitoring hearing, the magistrate will ask us if there's any changes to the report, etc., or circumstances. So we've got that opportunity. And then it's really a conversation between the magistrate and the client. And that conversation will go, I suppose, however the client's going. Sometimes the clients need a bit of reinforcing about actually making the order a priority, making these decisions a priority to attend counselling, etc. But other times it's a celebration, like I can really tell that you're trying really hard. It's a process, keep going, etc. It can be really encouraging. So it really just depends. It's just, I suppose, in response to the client, what that conversation's like. Now, unfortunately, in mainstream courts, it was rolled out, it became part of the legislation as a program condition that could be added to the community correction order. In mainstream courts, it can't work that way. Community corrections officers aren't sitting in the same building oftentimes as a court for starters. So I suppose if a client's sentenced to judicial monitoring elsewhere, they show up at court, they haven't got a time. We actually give the client a time to show up to court. The judicial monitoring's heard outside of the main list. So they'll have to sit at court all day and wait for their matter to be called. They'll go into potentially a courtroom full of people who they don't know to have that discussion. The case manager's not there to support them. The report still will have been provided to the court, and there will be somebody from our court assessment prosecution team who do those court assessments and prosecute. They'll be there to record any actions the court may actually indicate need to occur when they're in there. But other than that, the client pretty much goes in, has a conversation from the bench, and then is told to leave. So if somebody's gone in and needed that extra encouragement about compliance, etc., and walking out with no support, it's a bit, it's probably not gone quite as well as it could. But I suppose the court's mindful of that, and I'm sure they manage it as best they can. But it just unfortunately hasn't translated to be the same process as it is here. And I think that our clients are really well supported here because of that. I think the main difference between, I actually went on secondment a few years ago for about 12 to 18 months, somewhere in between there, to a mainstream location again. We were having reforms, community corrections reforms, and I thought, oh, it's time. I'll go and spread the joy and love that is Neighbourhood Justice Centre to my colleagues in another region. And I suppose that gave me time to reflect on what the real differences are. As a practitioner in community correctional services for so long, half the time I've been here almost, but predominantly I've been in mainstream locations. I practice the way I practice. At the start I talked about, I suppose, what research tells us is best practice, and I strive to continue to improve that every day. And I suppose improve the tools that I have to work with clients. So I've got my diverse tools. But corrections is corrections, and what we do is what we do. So why is it so different? And it's really one thing, it's a culture. Wherever I am, I think my biggest frustration in corrections is other agencies saying, it's not my job, it's not my job. And at the end of the day, I was talking about clients being mandated. We're mandated. I don't get to pick necessarily who comes onto an order. We might say somebody's unsuitable. A court may override that. We still have to work with that client. And the same with parole. We might say unsuitable. Parole board might still say, no, you got him, look after him. And that's, I say him all the time, her as well, or them even. So, but my biggest frustration, it's not my job. And I think that's because people are really stretched with resources, etc. And if they've got somebody who's got nobody and they've got somebody who's got a community corrections officer, they're going to choose somebody who's got nobody if that's the only space they have to work with them. And also sometimes our clients aren't necessarily the most attractive. They might be pretty reactive to, I suppose, interactions with others and don't play well in the sandbox sometimes with some clients. And so that might be another dissuading factor for other agencies picking us up. What the difference is here is it's how can I help? We have a one client policy. A client walks into this building and needs support, we'll sit with them. It doesn't matter if they're corrections client or not, there's an individual there who needs support. I'm going to ascertain what support they need, and I'm going to make a warm referral either within the building or to a community agency and work with them on that. I remember a while ago I was coming back from lunch and there was a client standing from the NJC. I'd seen him up on the court floor. It was a family violence day. And he had his little bag. So he'd obviously not done the right thing and been kicked out of home. His little suitcase, I should say. And he had a smile on his face, but his eyes weren't smiling. And I thought, I said, come in and have a chat. So he did. We had a bit of a talk, maybe 10, 15 minutes was all really about where he was at and how he was feeling. It wasn't great. His world had come to an end and he took responsibility for that, but really didn't know where to go to from here. We were able to identify a whole lot of protective factors for him, and he assured me that he wasn't going to harm himself. He had plans for the rest of the day to go and talk to his boss, and he was going to call his father and have dinner with his family, etc. And he had a place to stay moving forward, so he was going to be able to move there. He came back for the family violence matter about a month later. It was an intervention order. He hadn't been charged with anything, but there was an intervention order in place, and that was being finalised a month later. And he came, he actually sought me out, and he said, I was actually going to, my plan was to leave, get in the taxi, and I had a place to go to kill myself where it was quiet, where it was isolated. That's the difference here. We've got the space to do that, and that's one life that we didn't lose to that. And I've seen him, because it's been 18 months since that all happened. He is great guns, thriving, doing all the right things and living his best little life, which is amazing. And it's so sad that things could have happened differently. Same with our clients. A CCS client might walk in. If somebody from corrections is around, we know and we trust somebody will pick him up and somebody will make sure that they're reconnected back into corrections or that they have the services they need. We had a client who he was sentenced to a community correction order with a term of imprisonment. He appealed that sentence and he went to county court, and the county court struck out the magistrate's court order so that he commenced the community correction order that day, and he was discharged from custody. Fortunately, he'd had some interaction pre-sentence with a family violence counsellor that works at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre. So he came looking for them and walked into our building. He had nothing except for the clothes on his back. That was it. He had no identification. He had nowhere to live. He had no food. He had no money. He had nothing. He'd been discharged from the cells, I suppose, near the county court, and with nothing except for what he had, and he'd walked down here. So within 20 minutes, he had a housing worker there. He was linked in, had an appointment for substance abuse counsellor. He had a assessment completed, a brief assessment by the mental health clinician to make sure that he wasn't actively suicidal at that point, because he had been suicidal previously. He had a community corrections officer. We started working with him then and there because he wasn't on order with us as well. He's gone on to, he completed a traineeship in construction, and he's now working full-time in construction. He has stable accommodation and, again, living his best life. And he's somebody who walked in here with nothing, and I make it sound like really easy. It was just nice. Within 20 minutes, I could gather those services and everyone was all in. How can I help? And I suppose I'm using that to highlight the difference for me as a practitioner, having an absolute abundance of colleagues that are really, really keen to support our clients, and the difference that makes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Beth. Thanks for coming and speaking today. Thank you to everyone that has attended, and I hope to see you all again soon.